Here it's a day when the sun's shining. I think we timed it right in terms of the weather. It could have been a very different story last week, and it's not an easy place to get to. And I just think really well done, all of us. We've all got busy lives. We've got a lot of commitments and responsibilities, and I think it's really fantastic that we're all here to support the women in Downview Prison. I want to think about this slogan that we've come up with: no males in female jails. I think that word males, it's an important and it's a significant word. When we say no males in female jails, we use the word male. Male as in male violence, male supremacy, male domination. All of these words and terms that have been developed and used by feminists over decades now to analyse and describe the situation that we find ourselves in under a system of patriarchy that has lasted at least 5,000 years on this planet. As women, we live with the reality of male violence all around us. And I say this as we enter perhaps the darkest time now in our European history that any of us, certainly darker than any time I can remember, and maybe that any of us can remember. And we stand in solidarity and horror with what is happening to our sisters in Ukraine and all the people in Ukraine faced with this unimaginable aggression and threat to their lives and life as they know it in that country. And I think we cannot proceed with today's action here without taking a moment to think of what is happening there. And we probably all feel quite powerless, but just to take a moment as an act of solidarity with the people of Ukraine and our sisters and the children of Ukraine, perhaps in particular. Violence all around us. Last night I had the great privilege and great enjoyment to meet with some women locally, talking about forming a local group where we live. And on my journey home with two other women, on our very short journey home, it was not very far, but a journey of maybe about 5 or 6 miles, we passed one house where in the last few years a man had killed his ex-wife and her mother, shot them and shot the family dog at their house. It was on our route home. And then a bit further on, a couple of miles further on, we passed another house where a woman a couple of years ago was strangled by a man who I believe was also her ex-partner. This was just in a matter of a few miles, in a sort of quite a quiet place where we live. This morning on our drive here, in the car, we passed a spot where I think a couple of years ago a woman died at the spot on the road as we were driving up to London. She died in tragic circumstances, and her body when it was laid to rest in the crematorium or in the hospital morgue, was defiled by a man who was later found to be a double murderer and who had defiled at least 100 women's bodies in that same place. And we passed that spot, and Anne said, "Oh, this is that spot where that young woman died." And I'm just reminded of the words of her mother when it came to light of what had been done to her precious daughter. And she said, She said men and women across this country will be appalled at what they are hearing. And she says to them, she says to us, if this was your loved one, you would roar with rage, and I am silently roaring. And I think there are women up and down the country that are silently roaring with her. And I hope that our roars will not be so silent for much longer. So when we speak of male violence, it's a daily reality that we know well, and certainly the women in this prison will know well. And it's part of course, a wider system of male domination, male supremacy. It's a very literal and physical manifestation of the force that any oppressive system uses to maintain that oppression. So let's not forget the context of male violence. And let's think about the women incarcerated here at Downview and the reality of male violence that they will have experienced. Many of them, if not all, will have experienced in their personal histories. According to the Prison Reform Trust, over half the women in prison report having suffered violence at the hands of a male partner. I would think that is some quite serious underestimation. That's the figure they give us. And they say that 53% of incarcerated women report emotional, physical, and/or sexual abuse as a child. And again, I would think the numbers are likely to be far higher than that. In 2020, women were sent to prison either on remand or to serve a sentence on just over 5,000 occasions. How do women end up in prison? We know the context of how and why women end up in places like this. Poverty, homelessness, dependency on drugs or alcohol, alongside the histories of male violence that I've just mentioned. So when we think about male violence, we're not just thinking about those individual acts that those women have been subjected to, but we're thinking about a wider system of patriarchy, of capitalist patriarchy, of racist capitalist patriarchy that inexorably produces inequality that will mean some women will end up on the bottom of the pile inevitably because of the political and economic system that we are living under. We know that women are sent to prison for non-violent crimes, for things like credit card fraud, theft, shoplifting. More women are sent to prison for theft than for violence against the person, robbery, sexual offences, drugs offences and motoring offences combined. Then all of those things combined. So that gives us an idea of why women are being incarcerated. And it's certainly not for violent crimes or for crimes of sexual violence. And it is in the context of the serious disadvantage and histories of experiencing male violence that these women have experienced. And we know, I did talk about this last time when we were outside the Ministry of Justice. I do urge you all, if you haven't already seen it, to read the report from Foston Hall, which does make for really very shocking reading of the situation of women in that estate, where with a population of 272 women prisoners in that estate, there was a statistic of 1,000 calls being made in 1 month to the Samaritans, and I think that tells us something about the situation of those women. There are record levels of self-harm in that prison, as there are across the women's estate, and women are 7 times more likely to harm themselves than male prisoners. And while all this is going on, the government now has plans to build 500 new places to incarcerate 500 more women in the estate, rather than providing the funding to equip local communities with facilities and women's centres to accommodate and support women outside of the prison system. So that's obviously a whole other dimension to the particular campaign that we're here talking about today. What happens when women want and need justice for ourselves? So we've got a criminal justice system that seems very keen and very enthusiastic about incarcerating women for non-violent offences. But what about when women want justice? What about when women are raped, when women experience violence from male partners and male family members and other men that they know?
And the police.
What about when we want them brought to justice? Well, you've probably seen that a report that came out just this week told us what we've already known for a long time, that victims and survivors of rape are being systematically failed in England and Wales. Women who've been raped and who want to pursue the criminal justice route have an average wait of almost 2 years before a trial begins. One case mentioned in that report took 16 years to come to trial. 16 years because of what was claimed was an apparent lack of evidence, despite the presence of DNA at the crime scene. 16 years. But as I say, on average, 2 years. And that's even after a charge has been brought against the perpetrator. And we know that in this country at the moment, fewer than 1 in 60 of all reported rape cases result in a perpetrator being charged. 1 in 60, which means that basically men are raping with impunity.
It's de facto legal.
So I wonder how many of the women incarcerated behind these walls are survivors of rape, and how many of their rapists or their partners who've been violent to them or their fathers who've abused them, how many of them are incarcerated?
Yeah.
I would imagine very, very few. And now, to add insult to injury, the few rights that women have in prison are now being subordinated to men, many, if not all of whom, will have raped, coerced, beaten or otherwise oppressed women or violated women. So when we say no males in female jails, let's remember that term male. It's important. We're not talking about any kind of women. We're not talking about these mythical creatures, trans women who don't exist. We are talking about men who basically are liars. Some people say trans-identified men. I quite often say men who demand that we pretend they're women, but I'm more and more inclined simply to say what they are, which is liars. Men who are lying, men who know they're men, we know they are men, who are lying and who unfathomably have managed to wrap the criminal justice system, the MOJ, around their little finger and get them dancing to their tune. So these questions of language are not immaterial, they're not academic, they're absolutely crucial. When we are talking about no males in female jails, we are saying no males, as in male violence, male domination, the will to violate women's spaces and women's bodies by men. That's what we are talking about. We are talking about men, members of that group, that routinely rape, violate and oppress women. No men in women's prisons, no males in female jails.
Yes, thank you.